There are two stories about how my grandmother died, at least two. She died in her own bed, in her own apartment. The family gathered together in the days preceding her death. Always a competitive person, she had outlived her sister-in-law by then, at 93 years, and seemed to be ready, even at peace. Everyone agrees on what happened, on when and where it happened, but not exactly on how it happened. Because I was told recently she had written a note to self about the number of a certain kind of pill to take, and her son had found it in a book. And years earlier, after her husband had died, the morphine used to ease the pain from the cancer that killed him had disappeared. Lastly, as she literally lay dying, someone in the family suggested they take her to the hospital. She replied, "No, I'm not doing it there." That she died a peaceful, even triumphant death in her own bed, in her own home, in her own time, we know for sure. Did she kill herself? I doubt it, as does the rest of the family. Although she did stop eating in her last days. Was it a natural death? I think so. Did it involve her making a choice to die? I think so. There are a million reasons for me not to talk about natural death this morning. So I'll give you just three. Few people like to talk about death. It's a rare person who likes to think about his or her own death. No one really likes to think about his or her loved ones dying. Nevertheless, everyone we know and have ever loved will die. There's no if. We can never know when. You've taught me that time and time again, so now I forget less frequently. Apparently, as we saw this past week, even when we're locked up, strapped down, and the experts are intent on killing us, we can't know exactly when, or ultimately, even how. But no matter where we stand on the death penalty, this very public and difficult death is an example of the power we hold as citizens, lawmakers, and law enforcers to determine when and how other human beings will die. Whether or not we want that much power, and many of us would rather not have it, we cannot rid ourselves of it. And it reaches far beyond the walls of our prisons into our hospitals, our nursing homes, our assisted living facilities, living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms. When death comes, it will find us. And more often than not, in 2014, death will demand that someone make a decision. Not just for those guilty of violent crimes, but for each and every one of us. We could call it the new nature of life and death in the 21st century. The fact is, most people today will face death after a long medical struggle with an incurable condition, one or some combination of C diseases, physicians call it today, cancer, congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, cardiomyopathy, cirrhosis of the liver, and there are more. I learned this in a presentation by Dr. Jennifer Clark, a physician at Hillcrest Hospital, who also told us there's a 90% chance patients today will grow older with worsening medical problems, which means in order to die, someone will have to discontinue some medication and or remove some machine. We do hold the power of life and death in our hands. It's the very same message Marlon will deliver to our 9th graders at our next 2 coming-of-age services. It may feel like too strong a message to some for 9th graders, but the reality is that once they and we become sexually active, once we drive cars, once we enlist, start to drink alcohol. We all hold life and death in our hands. Since this is true, can't really be debated, one might wonder, what's all the fuss about then? Why argue about the right to die? Why debate? We have no choice but to die. I mean, who needs a right to breathe? The classic liberal position on choice follows naturally from here. If we ask our children to be responsible with the power they wield, then we also share in that responsibility, of course. In matters of life and death, we must also make rational and responsible decisions. That's what it means to be fully human, not godlike, just fully human. And yet, who chooses suicide in a vacuum? Writes Ben Matlin, a self-described good pro-choice liberal and lifelong disabled person. We are inexorably affected by our immediate environment, he continues. I've learned how easy it is to be perceived as someone whose quality of life is untenable, even or perhaps especially by doctors. Indeed, I hear it from them all the time. How have you survived so long? Wow, you must put up with a lot. Even during routine office visits, when all I've asked for is an antibiotic for a sinus infection. Strangers don't treat me this way, but doctors feel entitled to render judgments and voice their opinions. To them, I suppose, I must represent a failure of their profession, which is short-sighted. I am more than my diagnosis and my prognosis. My father lives in Boston, where Ben Matlin is from, and today has Alzheimer's disease. He has hardly any short-term memory at this point. Conversations tend to be shorter and shorter. It's as if he's here and he's not here at the same time. Last week, in the middle of a work day, I received a text from my brother. Dad has a fever, not sure what's up. Check in with you later. At first I worried, a fever? Oh no, how sick is he? Is this it? And then quickly my thoughts changed course. And I wondered if he might not be spared what was coming next. And to be honest, I wondered if we might all not be spared what we feel is coming next. Considering the complexity of these life and death matters, more and more, I understand the urge to say, let's just leave this in God's hands. It's too big a decision for me or you to make. Yes, I know you're a doctor. I know you're my closest sibling. I know you're my daughter. You're my trusted best friend, but still, can't we just let the fates decide, let karma unfold? It's so tempting. And of course, a few of us will get lucky. We will die in our sleep, on the couch, doing the crossword puzzle in the middle of the night, maybe making love. But we've also learned from the three ladies of the advanced directives, as they're called, Karen Ann Quinlan, Nancy Cruzan, and Terry Schiavo, that not deciding, that leaving it to destiny becomes a decision of its own kind. Since once someone is in a coma, either someone decides to remove life support or they don't. And the body can and will linger a long time on life support. Karen Quinlan lived for 9 years in a persistent vegetative state from the age of 23 to the age of 30. Terry Schiavo had a heart attack at 26 and lasted until she was 41 in a persistent vegetative state with only a feeding tube. It seems the art of dying is a dying art, an art much in need of a renaissance, if you ask me. So I ask you this morning to consider, how do you want to approach your own death? Do you want to know as much as you can or not? Do you want to live when you can no longer eat or drink? Do you want to live when you can no longer recognize your loved ones? There are no right or wrong answers. When I have the conversation with people, I hear most often, "I'd like to die quickly and with as little pain as possible. I don't want to be a burden to my family." Our desires seem to be simple, common even. Common in the sense that many of our final wishes are the same, and common in the sense that we all wonder how we will die. And still, our capacity to avoid the conversation, obfuscate, postpone, and procrastinate are truly impressive. Here are a few facts from a document prepared by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and there are copies for you in the back of the sanctuary. Fact number 1, 60% of people say that making sure their family is not burdened by tough decisions is extremely important, and yet 56% have not communicated their end-of-life wishes. Fact number 2, 70% of people say they prefer to die at home, yet 70% die in the hospital, nursing home, or long-term care facility. Fact number 3, 80% of people say that if seriously ill, they would want to talk to their doctor about end-of-life care, yet only 7% report having had an end-of-life conversation with their doctor. The disconnect between what we say we want and what we do is not only disconcerting, it's dangerous. Dr. Jennifer Clark says patients with a serious illness want 4 things: pain and symptom control, to avoid prolongation of the dying process, to relieve burdens on family, and to strengthen relationships with loved ones. But the 4 things hospitalized patients get are physical suffering, poor communication regarding goals of medical care, care discordant with patient and family preferences, financial, physical, and emotional burdens on the family. We seem, in the period of about 50 years, to have wiped out centuries of tradition, experience, and wisdom, and created a new challenge for each and every one of us: how to die. Do I feel guilty about the thoughts I had when I heard my dad had a fever? After much reflection, no, I don't. He once told me he would have the letters DNR tattooed on his chest. I don't think my dad has any tattoos. It's past the time when I can have a conversation with him about how he wants to die. But when I think about a merciful death for him, instead of guilty or godlike, I feel loving and honest. You may or may not know that in the 15th century, a text called the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, was an extraordinarily popular text, which I think it might be time to translate and republish. I'm confident no one votes to intentionally make people suffer. But for some reason today, we tolerate needless suffering among seriously ill people and their families, despite the fact that we are caring and generally sensible people. And like with so many issues, it might be, I ask you to consider this morning, that the political rhetoric is drowning out the common sense of the common people who share common goals. Dr. Ira Byock, who I quoted before, well-known author on the art of dying, calls the debate about physician-assisted suicide a brawl on the lawn of a burning building, a debilitating distraction from the people trapped inside our institutions who need help now. How do we help them? There are 4 fundamental ethical principles that people use when they are making difficult decisions. They are useful to consider when talking about choice at the end of life. They are autonomy, our right to self-determination, beneficence, the priority to do good, non-maleficence, the priority to do no harm, and justice, the priority to treat all people fairly, no matter their race, color, economic status, creed, or lack of religious belief. And yet, in contradiction to these commonly held ethical principles, the Catholic mandate on comatose patients reads thus: Catholics must provide nutritional assistance to patients with irreversible conditions who can reasonably be expected to live indefinitely if given such care. And providing food and water always represents a natural means of preserving life, never a medical act. So I ask, when is living indefinitely natural? Yes, in our child's heart, we want everyone to live forever. Yet with our adult minds, we know it's impossible. From experience, we know we have been and will be forced to choose again between two good or two bad outcomes, as we do all our lives, which is why we have and do ethics, to help us make decisions when they are particularly difficult. When one choice is clearly beneficial to self and others, and the other is clearly detrimental to self and others, there's no need. We don't need ethics to decide whether to operate on a child with a tumor when no one else will suffer as a result of that operation. You with me? But what if there's only one surgeon available, and there are two children in need of immediate attention? Then we have two bad choices before us. Save one child and let the other die. Try to save both and lose both. Let's just throw in that one child is rich and the other and can pay for the operation, while the other is poor and cannot afford medical care. Now we need a developed ethical framework to make a choice and be able to stand by it. Because death is not the enemy of life, we can make compassionate, caring, careful, deliberate, ethical decisions about when, where, and how we die. In fact, in today's world, we are forced to. We can take diagnosis and treatment options, our values and preferences, considerations for quality of life, and the wider context of our lives, which includes family, the law, hospital and insurance company policies, religious beliefs, all into consideration. All of that deliberation allows us to be active in this last ritual of love. We all know that loving and grieving the loss of those we love gives our lives meaning. Dying is the last part of living we are privileged to take part in. It's an opportunity to demonstrate we know we are all connected before we are born and after we die. Religious arguments against allowing natural death circle around what I call a trinity of principles. First, a prohibition against playing God. Second, a slippery slope argument about how if we allow decisions for death to be made openly and honestly, then we will lose our respect for life itself. And third, a deference to the power of nature, natural law theory, and thus an obligation to receive and respect God's gift of life. Yet the Catholic Church, in its publicly proclaimed policies to protect life, prolongs life to the point where the body is battered, not respected or revered. After witnessing a good death last weekend at St. John's, a nurse told me out in the hall afterwards that she had seen and smelled several times when a person's hands had started to rot on a body which was living indefinitely. She looked me in the eye and said, "That's how I know we've waited too long." Despite the media pundits who lead us to believe our country is divided on this issue, the Pew Research Center reports that equally strong majorities of both political parties, as well as independents, approve of laws that let patients decide about being kept alive through medical treatment. Who knew? How would you know? How would you know that more than 80% of people surveyed in New Hampshire, a majority Republican state, indicated it was very important to have their dignity respected, preferences honored, pain controlled, and not to leave the family in debt? Only 7% felt it was very important to be kept alive as long as possible. Only 1% said they would prefer being in the hospital, and not a single person wanted to be in a nursing home to die. Those 80% of the people who are Catholics and Protestants and Pentecostals and Jews and atheists and agnostics and who knows what they are all pro-life. Yes, you heard me. They are all pro-life because they are pro all of life, from the beginning until the end. We can be ardently pro-life and have nothing to do with pro-life politics. We can care for people. And in fact, here at All Souls, we do care for people who are fighting for their lives with the same compassion, devotion, and energy as we care for people who are ready to die. In affirming life, we embrace all of it, including dying, death, and grief. If you've ever been present when someone dies, you know that death, like life, is a gift. So I want to finish by telling you about a very recent death with our member Virginia's permission. During dinner last Friday, Virginia's husband mentioned that his left hand felt numb. A few moments later, he noticed the same all along his left arm. Within a few more minutes, he felt some numbness throughout his left side. Virginia knew right away it was a stroke. When her husband said, "No, I can't stand or walk," she called 911. The chaplain, kindly, at Methodist Manor, found the care team number on her website and called us. After the neurologist had visited with the family, I arrived. "I don't know how to do this," Harold's daughter said to me. "What do you need to say to your dad?" I asked. "The basics are often the best. Thank you. I love you. I'll never forget you. Maybe please forgive me, or I forgive you, depending on the relationship you had with him. Or please know, Dad, you already live on in me and in my daughter, and I will make sure your grandchildren know who you are." I told them they could touch and hold this man they loved, that even though hospitals are awkward and antiseptic places, they had my permission to climb right on into bed with him and hold him if they liked. And I left the room for them to say their goodbyes. They joined me in the waiting room, and we all returned once the respirator had been removed. We talked about being made of stardust. The nurse poked her head in from time to time to share an update on vital signs. His heart was not really beating, she said, but was still emitting an electrical signal. We wondered at the mysterious chemistry and physics of the body and the wild alchemy of human life and love. Howard had loved classical music, it turned out, and so I pulled up a Bach cello suite on my phone and laid it gently on his bed. We witnessed the transformation as it happened, the changing colors of his face, the deepening blue of his fingertips and then his hands, the growing stillness and coldness of his body. We cried and trembled together. We wept. We honored life, all of life. I cannot imagine a better way to protect and promote life than this. I knew it would be hard, but I also knew it was a great gift his 18-year-old granddaughter turned to say to me. "It is indeed," I answered. "I'm so glad and grateful you know that." Harold didn't have an advance directive, but his family knew his heart and they knew their own minds. Loving care is an authentic and invaluable clinical modality, is one of my favorite lines from Dr. Bayok's new book, The Best Care Possible. So what can we do? We can certainly offer loving care to one another. We can also talk about death and our feelings about death directly and honestly, with each other, with our families, with our physicians, and with our lawyers too. The biggest thing that will make a difference in how you die is having the conversation, not having the advance directive, which doesn't always make it to the ER or into the car or onto the plane to your vacation destination. Nevertheless, do fill out the paperwork for the church, for your lawyer, and for your doctors. Talk it out until you and they know your heart and your mind. Because most likely, someone will have to decide for you when, where, and how you die. If you want it to be, that someone could be you.